and welcome to my latest video. In this video I'm going to be showing you how to paint a Black Templar. The model that you can see on the screen there is made up of the ancient Primus standard bearer and some of the Black Templar's upgrade set pieces. Games Workshop sent me some of the Black Templar model kits and things a while ago, so I thought I might as well put them to good use. So obviously the model's all stuck together on prime black, apart from the head is just blue tacked on at the moment. You can glue it on if you want. I thought it'd just be easier to leave it off so that I could paint the eyes in a bit easier, but I do end up painting the eyes on with the head attached anyway, so you know you can pretty much just stick the whole thing together. To start with, here you can see I'm using a small dry brush. In this particular case it's an Artis Opus small dry brush, but you can pretty much use any kind of like chunky little brush. The most important thing is if you look on the wet palette there in the top left, so I've got some greys and black and white on there. And to start with, I'm using German grey, or you can use dark grey as well, or indeed just get some black paint, put a bit of white in it and get a dark grey colour. But the important thing is that you have to water the paint down. And as you're applying it, it's a sort of a stippling motion, just pretty much covering the whole model. Don't worry about the shoulder pads or any of the kind of like leather pouches, because obviously there's going to be a different colour. But just cover all of the armour. But it is a stippling motion. Don't try and dry brush it. Like brush the brush. You're kind of like stabbing at the model. And this is just it. One, it'll give it like a grayer look to start with, so you've already started the highlighting process, and it also gives it a bit of texture. So it'd just be a bit more interesting later on. And as I said, when you start adding the highlights and things, you've already started the process. It will be darkened down a little bit later because I am going to be using an oil wash on it. And it'll all kind of like blend together. It is going to look terrible for a good bit of the process, but when it all starts coming together at the end, I think it's kind of like worth the time spent on it. So the next colour is Basalt Gray, and again, you don't have to use Basalt Gray. You can just add a little bit of white to the previous dark grey that you were using. So if you've just got like black and white paint, all you do is you start off with a dark grey, and for each of the following steps you just add a little bit more white to it. You can get exactly the same process, same result. We're using the same process that I'm using here. And as you're applying this lighter grey, you can see I'm just doing exactly the same thing again, but where I'm applying the paint is a tiny little bit more restrained. Now I know it just looks terrible, but it is making life easier for later on when you do actually spend a bit of time painting the highlights on properly. But again, the paint has to be watered down, so it's around about on the wet palette, it's around about 50-50 water to paint. Now each paint is a little bit different, so you do have to test it out a bit, but you can kind of like generally see it leaves a mark, but it's a soft mark. If you just do this straight from the pot, so if you're using Games Workshop paint, say, and you take out, say, Mechanicum Grey, and you dab the paintbrush in that, obviously you rub it off on a piece of kitchen towel or whatever first, and then you start dabbing it to the model. What you're going to get is like a very heavy mark, strong paint buildup, and it'll leave a textured surface on the model. Now, not a texture as it like what I'm doing here with the simulated texture effect of like a weathering sort of thing. It'll actually be a three-dimensional texture, like a buildup of paint that will, you'll be able to feel it if you rub your finger over it when it's dry. You don't want that. It's kind of like a really bad, nasty result, and it's very hard to fix as well, because obviously the paint has already made that three-dimensional effect on the armour, and you pretty much have to strip it and start again. So make sure you water the paint down, and again, don't dry brush it on. Just kind of like stab it at the model. So stipple the paint on there. So I've added another couple of greys here. I'm not going to use them all at the same time, but just to start with, so it's neutral grey, and now this is very similar to Mechanicum Standard Grey. It's either Mechanicum or Mechanica Standard Grey, whatever it is. By Games Workshop is one of those two names. So all we're doing now is filling in the shoulder pads. Now that's because the shoulder pads are going to be a whitish colour. I say whitish because they're going to be really grimy, and they'll look white in comparison to the armour, but nothing really is white. Because there's always light reflecting on it, or there's dirt on it, or whatever, But so technically it's white, but it's only white because it looks lighter than everything else when we paint it on. You can see there that was just one coat that I gave it, and again it was watered down around about 50-50 water to paint. but you may find that you need it a little bit thinner or a little bit thicker depending on the paint that you happen to use at the time. Because depending on if you've left your paint open for a little bit too long, or even just how the manufacturers have made it, the paint can be have different consistencies. So, always double check to make sure that the consistency that you get is the one that you want before applying it. So yeah, it's just a case of probably like 2 coats with that particular paint. Sometimes you need more. Now that's interesting green stuff. This is just sort of putty, so this doesn't dry. The putty that I'm using here, it's called like a stress relief putty. It's like it's stuff, if you're a bit stressed, you just kind of like squeeze it and mold it into shapes. It's very soft. It's not greasy or anything like that, so you can just stick it on the model. So I'm using this for masking. So you just place it all on the model, kind of like this. It looks like it's had a bad day fighting Nurgle, but it's just masked off the area so that I can then airbrush a colour on just very quickly. So you saw there, that was just very quickly, that was some Vallejo airbrush thinner. I put that into a syringe and then inject that into the airbrush cup. Now the reason for that is so I can put exactly the amount that I want in. So just a tiny little bit there in the bottom. I'm not going to mix any water with it. Normally you would. You don't need pure airbrush thinner when mixing it with paint, but it's such a small amount of airbrush thinner and paint that I'm using. I think you can get away with just using pure airbrush thinner in this case. And here I'm using P3 Morrow White for for what I'm going to be airbrushing. It's you don't have to use P3 Morrow White. I just prefer to use it. I like how smooth it is for painting, but pretty much all whites are they're just terrible to work with. I'm also mixing a little bit of a Baden Black in there. Now the reason for that is, one, I don't want a pure white colour. I could have just used a light grey that I had lying around, but this just gives me a bit more control about how light it is. I don't want it very white, but I don't want it too dark either. So but the other thing is, because black has very small pigment particles, and white has very big pigment particles, and by mixing them together, it just means it flows a little bit better. There you saw when I did that first spray with the airbrush. Don't do that. Check your pressure and your spray before you apply it to the model. So that was just a complete rookie mistake. I am rushing this model quite a bit, so I do make a few mistakes in this. I'm going to try and pick them all up as we go through the video. But you can see there, I'm just airbrushing like the top section. You don't have to be neat with this at all. I've got around about 30 psi. It's a size 0.4 needle. Just be a bit neater than what I've done, but it does the job. So you can see it's lighter at the top than it is at the back of the shoulder pads, and that'll just helps with the sort of the light direction kind of effect, because I am going to paint the armor with a light direction as well. So here, just very quickly, I took some black paint and just filled in all the bits where I'd got some overspray, so like the armor trim and the little Black Templar cross as well. Now we're going to be using neutral grey again, which would be around about 50-50, I guess, black and white. But it doesn't matter too much exactly. It's just a very sort of neutralish grey colour. Or again, you could use Mechanicum Standard Grey, or indeed Mechanicus if it's that. I can't remember. And all you're doing is, so this is kind of like where the actual proper painting begins, because everything that you've done up to this stage is just using very simple quick techniques to get paint on the model. Now you actually do have to be very specific with the paint marks that you're making, and this is I say very specific. Now the painting that I'm going to be doing here with the neutral grey, I paint it too detailed, and that's, so you might think, well, yeah, that's fine. No, I've wasted my time a little bit. I could have probably cut down how long this model takes to paint by a lot, just by painting this more roughly, because the oil wash is going to go over this and blend it all in. So I don't need to make these marks as neat as I am making them. But what I am doing is I'm picking out all the edge highlights that are upwards facing. So you're not going to edge highlight the whole model. It takes too long, and you get just as good a result really by just picking out the upwards edges, because that's naturally where the light's catching it. So it actually looks a little bit more realistic as well. And it gives just enough detail and definition to all the shapes. So just pick out those upwards facing edges, and then on the curved parts of the armor, so you can see like on the knee pad there, and on the cover of the lip just above the knee, we're painting on light volumes. So you can see on the knee, it's a very sort of round shape, and I kind of stippled it on. You don't need to stipple it on if you want, just paint a little round circle there, and then maybe sort of mush the brush around the edges so it's a bit broken up. You don't want very clean, sharp shapes for the light volumes. If it's a bit rough and ready, it works a bit better, because when you put the oil wash over it, it will help blend it together. So the sharper the shape is that you paint on, the harder it is for the oil wash to make it look blended in. You can just stipple it. You can see here, it doesn't take too long, but again, you don't have to be as neat as I'm doing. I mean, to be fair, when I was painting this, like I hadn't done this particular process for a Black Templar before, and I was trying to decide, what would work the best, and so it was a little bit, I was learning as I was going. Like, obviously, I've painted plenty of Space Marines, and I've done a similar technique with other Marines, but every time you change the colour, you have different, obstacles that you have to overcome. And I always tweak the process a little bit, see if I can make it a bit quicker or just make something look a little bit different here and there. So yeah, in this case, I'm being too neat. You don't need to be this neat, because we are going to touch up all these highlights after we've done the oil wash anyway. So just slap that paint on, get the highlights where you want them, and then move on with the process. The main thing to get right is actually is just make sure that all the light is on the upwards facing sections. I'm not doing any bounce highlights. There's no complicated highlight placement. Or just hold the model under a lamp, pick like the best angle for the front facing angle of the model, and the lamp will give you a good indication of where to place all these primary highlights. Then just turn the model around to the back, do the same thing. You can do it also at the side as well if you want. So what you might find a little bit though is, and you probably see this as I paint a bit more on the model, especially on the little ball things on the backpack, I put there ends up being 3 shine points on, so one from the front, one from the back, and one from the side. Now you probably can see them a little bit from both, multiple shine points depending on how you hold the model. It's not super realistic, but it just suggests maybe that there are different lights on the battlefield. So, ignore anyone that says, "Oh, that's a bit weird." Just say, "There's 3 explosions going off." So, it's just, it makes the model look a bit more interesting having the light volumes painted on there anyway. And if you do want to spend time making the painting a little bit neater, or using it as, let's say, a character model or something, the most important area to spend the time on is the head and chest and the shoulder right next to it section. That's where everyone is going to look and pay the most attention to. Where you spend the least amount of time is on the feet, because no one cares, and after that it's the back. Right? If you want to spend a bit of time but you want to make the model look a bit nicer, and you don't have a lot of time, then focus on the head really as the primary point. If you want to blend all the highlights in just that little bit more. But as I said, hold the model under a lamp. It really will help you with the light placement. Now it won't give you an accurate result for the size of the highlights, because that is entirely dependent on what the light source would be on the battlefield, the size of the light source, how close it is to the model, and the material that the armor is made of. So just paint whatever you think looks good in terms of light volumes. It can make a difference in if it's a shiny or matte surface, all sorts of things like that. In this case, it looks a bit over highlighted, so it's almost kind of like a non-metallic metal colour, but I haven't put in any bounce highlights. Now I know people still will still mistake it for a non-metallic effect just because of the light volumes on the armour, but that would be the same for like a satin black anyway, kind of. But there's no like secondary reflections bouncing on the underside of things, or nothing like that, no coloured reflections and things. It is purely just very simple primary highlight light volumes on there. There you can see just before that I painted on very, very quickly some Mournfang Brown onto the leather areas and the skull, and then I'm using Metal Alchemy Necro Gold from Scale 75. You don't have to use that particular gold if you can't get hold of it. I just really like the colour that it is, but any kind of golden colour will work fine, especially because again you're going to be giving it an oil wash and it's going to have some verdigris put on it as well. So the actual finished colour of it is going to be quite different to what the colour is from the pot. Also, make sure you water down the metallics, just so that you get a nice smooth finish. So here I'm using Vallejo. Which Vallejo colour was it? Gunmetal. And just fill in all the metallic parts. So the really nice thing about using oil washes is that it makes using true metallics. If you like, I don't really like that term, true metallics, but if you're using metallic paint, then putting a quick oil wash over the top makes them look really good, and just shades them nicely, very very quickly and easily. You can see here I'm just filling in the sword blade as well. Now, if you want to spend more time on the sword, or you want to do it as a power weapon with lightning coming out, from that little stalk thing on it, or you want to do it like I think people like blue for some reason. Power swords are all painted like sort of a shiny blue colour and things. Then you can do that. Just be aware it will add a significant amount of time to painting the model, whereas I'm trying to get this done as quickly as possible while still having a nice effect at the end. So here, one final thing just before we get to the oil wash is I'm just going to put a very basic highlight on the skull. Now that's because the Mournfang brown that's already on there, it's really dark, so the skull it'll basically look burnt. If you want like a burnt skull and put an oil wash on, that's fine. The problem is it just doesn't stand out very much. So I'm just very quickly putting some Morghast bone on there. Now there's a big tonal jump between Mournfang brown, especially because it had a black primer underneath and I didn't do a perfectly opaque finish. So it's even darker than an opaque Mournfang brown. It's it's very dark anyway. And then putting the Morghast bone on top, it stands out quite a lot. Now the Morghast bone again is watered down around about 1 part water to 1 part paint, so it's quite translucent. But even then, the marks that you make stand out quite strongly. Again, the oil wash will fix all of that. So don't worry too much if anything looks a little bit rough. And again, don't be too intimidated by how I've painted the armor with the highlights on there. I've done them wrong. I've spent too long. Now, it didn't take me that long, but I've had a lot of practice with highlight placement and things. So it took me, I don't know, about 40 minutes or something just to paint all these highlights on the armor using neutral grey. But you could probably get the whole process done in like 10 or 15 minutes just by being a bit looser with how you do it. And it's exactly the same for the skull painting here. Just rough, very quickly, smack on some highlight colour. Try and make it more opaque at the front, and then you can just have it more scribbly at the sides, more translucent, so the Mournfang brown underneath is showing through. It'll work sort of like for the transition, just to help it along a little bit. But really don't spend too long doing it. It'll just help again with the oil wash, and it'll help as well for later on for the highlight placement. So when you paint over it, just to pick out some of the highlights, you'll be a good way through to where you need to be. I said the final thing was the skull. I forgot. So we're putting some. I mentioned earlier. We're putting verdigris onto the gold sections to give. So the whole model is going to be very heavily weathered, really. So I'm using Sotek green, which is sort of a turquoise colour, really, and you just slap it on there. Focus mainly. So it's watered down a lot. So this is maybe 1/2, 2 parts even water to 1 part paint, and you just focusing on the recesses. So you can see, like on the skull there, in the eye sockets, get it in there. Anywhere where the wings connect to the kind of like the base of the feathers. Just flood those areas, all in the recesses. Same again on the sword as well. Get it around the skull, in the eye sockets, on the pommel with the eagle head. Don't worry too much about going over the top, because after we've added the oil wash, one, it's going to dull it all down anyway, and then we're going to go back with the gold very quickly at the end just to pick out a few pieces, so you'll still be able to see a sort of a metallic finish on it anyway. You'll also probably see that on the shoulder, I painted that the other side of the shoulder, that's a metallic gold as well, because it's got that sort of neck protection guard bit on there, and that blends into the trim. So I kind of like looked at it and thought, well, that it should all be metallic anyway. Like, you don't have to paint it like that if you don't want. I don't really care one way or the other. So for the Verdigris, the next stage for the Verdigris, add a little bit of white to the Sotek green. Be a bit more refined in how you place it. Again, you're looking to stick it into the recesses. You still want it watered down quite a bit though. A little bit watered. Like, if you keep the same mixture that it was, so say it was 2 parts water to 1 part paint before, just add a little bit of white to it, but don't add any more water. So it'll be a tiny bit thicker, a tiny bit lighter, but just be more careful with the position. So just on the very kind of like deepest creases and recesses, you're not looking to cover the whole of the gold area, because that will really just knock back the all the gold areas. So now we're on to the oil wash. I'm using the new glass plate from Redgrass Games. It just makes it a bit easier. If you've got a bit of glass laying around or a tile or something like that, that would also be perfect. I just found that having the glass plate that I could put inside, one of the wet palette holder cases, means I can keep the paint and use it a bit longer without it drying out. But it is what it is. It's a a handy glass plate. Now, this is where I made a slight mistake. You saw I showed you matte varnish there, and so I'd given the model a coat of varnish. Now, I'm going to so the reason I've left the matte varnish there and I haven't put a big cross through the screen and said don't use matte varnish is because I use matte varnish, and that's the result. If you want to get the same result that I do when you paint the model, you have to use the matte varnish. However, look what's happening as I'm putting this on there. So this is super. So I mixed the burnt sienna and the black oil paint together, put a lot of the mineral spirit, so you can see there that big watered down patch, put some of that on, then it's just pretty much pure mineral spirits there that I'm just rubbing all over the model. Look how brown it is. That's because I've used the matte varnish. The matte varnish soaks it in, and it just leaves it brown. And it's at this stage as I'm covering the model, and I'm like, normally at this stage, the more of the mineral spirit I add, it just washes it off, because you're supposed to do a gloss varnish. Now, if you've seen my other videos where I've done an Imperial Fist and an Ultramarine, I did use a gloss varnish at that stage. But because I used a matte varnish, here's the result. So it's almost dry, but not quite. If you look on the shoulder pad there, it's still a little bit wet. I've rushed through this too quickly. If you see little shiny bits on your model, that's not dry. Don't start painting it yet like I am here, because you need it to be dry. But yeah, and also, like, so after after it's dry, then you give it another coat of varnish. If you like, you don't have to, but it just helps. It neatens everything up and everything like that. Gives a kind of like a slightly different finish. You could find, like, if you've used a gloss varnish before, you definitely need to do the sort of the matte varnish that I used there. And by the way, the matte varnish that I'm using again is the Vallejo Mecha varnish, matte varnish, for the finish before I add the paint here. And then if I use the gloss, now this is where I messed up. The Vallejo Mecha varnish, gloss varnish, it looks exactly the same. It's the same pot. We've got the same picture on the front. Right, so but I'm using those two for this. I have used other brands before. I've decided for certain reasons not to use them anymore. So the Vallejo Mecha varnishes matte and gloss, I think work really nicely. But as I said, if you want the exact same results that I get for this, you can use 2 layers of matte varnish. But if you want to do it properly and it won't be quite as brown, then do a gloss varnish before you do the oil wash, and then do the matte varnish after it's dry, completely dry. Let it dry. This sort of painting, it's really for batch painting, so you can do lots of them, then leave it all to dry, overnight or whatever. So earlier on, I mentioned about how I spent too long on the highlights before. Now you can see where with all the oil wash over the top, how it just knocks them right back, so they're really dull and blended in. That's why there's no point to do them spending that much time on them, because they're just really softened in there. But they do give you a really good base to work from. So what I'm doing now is just doing the same process again, but in a smaller area. And this is kind of like the hardest part of the painting. This is where you just have to be a little bit neater. So the colours that I'm using are neutral grey, dark sea grey, and pale blue grey. In that order. So neutral grey, that's the darkest highlight, the first one. Dark sea grey, that's the lighter one. So that's the top, second in from the right at the top there, that sort of very light grey. And then the pale blue grey, that's it's kind of like the off-white right in the middle of the wet palette there. And that's used as like a little dot shine. There is some white paint, so again it's the P3 Morrow White in the bottom right hand side of the wet palette there. And that's used as the very final highlight, so you can see the little dot on the forehead for the helmet. And again, don't spend too long doing all this, but just try and keep it as neat as you can. If you can't see where some of the highlights should go, then again, hold it under a light, like your lamp, and it'll give you, again, a pretty good indication of where the lights should be. But for the size of the highlights, these are much smaller than the ones you've done before. That will help with the transitions just blending in, because you obviously had the larger light volume highlights when you first slapped the paint on. So apart from that, really, it's pretty straightforward. You are kind of redoing what you've already painted, but just to reiterate, it is in a smaller area. If you kind of, depending on how shiny you want the model to look, you can sort of stop at the dark sea grey highlight level, or just save the pale grey blue for the very highest highlights. Or if you want it to be a bit more shiny, then add a little bit more pale grey blue, and then take the highlights up to white for the final highlights. It's entirely up to you, and again, it depends on how much time you want to spend on it. I would recommend just focusing on the focal points for pushing the highlights. So that would again be things like the head and chest sort of area. These knees actually are really nice to get highlighted as well. They're not necessarily good focal points, but they are a really nice shape. So it's easy to. So when people look at it, if you've got like a nice shine spot on those, it does sort of. It gives the impression that the rest of the armor is shiny as well. It's very easy to read and make it look good. But try not to make them quite as bright as the helmet still. So what I'm doing here is I decided to make the light volume a little bit bigger on the helmet. What that does, it makes it look a bit less shiny, so it's not such a little white dot floating in a black area. Because the shinier something is, the harder, or like the faster the transitions between the highlight spot going into the shadows. So if it's a really shiny black surface, like I say, almost like perfectly smooth, super gloss finish, it's almost just going to be like a white dot and then just black. Whereas the more matte it gets, the more transition you get. So you get like more grey added to the transition at the edge of the highlight. Whereas if it's like super matte, that will then disperse the light even more, and then you get a lot of grey, and you don't really get the tight shine spot. It just becomes like a very soft transition going from black to white. The only thing is, if you try and paint it like that, then it'll look it'll make the model look more grey. But that's natural. Like if a surface is very matte, it's not going to look very black. It's going to look more like a grey kind of surface anyway. So, I mean, I did mention like holding the model under the lamp, but really you should still be able to see where to put the highlights from where you put them before. But again, just to repeat myself again, the highlights are still smaller than before. So what that means is you'll have like a brown edge to all of your highlights. That will just help with the sort of like the dirty, grimy kind of look to it. Whereas if you just paint over the whole thing too much, you're just taking away kind of like the oil wash that's already there, and then it's kind of like a waste, really, almost doing the oil wash. Having said that, it clearly it shades like the weapon, all the metallic areas, the leather and stuff like that. And it does sort of soften all the transitions a bit as well. So like the more you paint over it, the less useful the wash has been, and the more work you're putting in. But it just depends on how much time you want to spend on the model, I suppose. So now we're going to work on the shoulder pads a little bit. So back to the pale grey blue. This is a bit tricky, and I will say that maybe, like, if you're just doing lots of troops, don't do this. Just save this for the like the sergeants or the special characters in your army or whatever, because there's a high chance this can go wrong. So what I did to start with was very quickly just sort of stipple, so like sort of stippling, but just putting a very gentle layer down on where I want the highlight to be using the pale grey blue, but still quite heavily watered down, so around about 1.5 parts water to 1 part paint, and tiny amounts of paint just using the tip of the brush. But now what I'm doing is just to blend it in, because it looks very textured there. So I'm just going to glaze over it. So again, using the pale grey blue, I put that in a well palette. You don't have to use a well palette, you can just use a tile or whatever, but you're turning it into a glaze. So it wants to be around about 4 or 5 parts water to 1 part paint. So it's very thin. You load up your brush, just completely flood it, then rub it off on some kitchen roll so that it's damp. So the bristles are damp, but they're not wet, because what you don't want to happen is when you touch the brush to the model, for the paint to flood off. And when it's very wet, so it's almost like the consistency of water. If there's a lot of paint on your brush, it'll just completely flood off, going onto the recesses and things, and make a mess. You want the brush to be kind of like damp with trace amounts of the glaze on there, and then you paint from like the mid-tones towards the highlight, then remove the brush, and just keep doing that over and over. It's easier if you have a slightly bigger brush, because you can cover the area in one stroke. Don't touch the area until it's dry. That's really important. So because if you do, you're going to just remove that layer of paint, and actually what happens is it dries at the edge first before it dries in the middle. So if you touch an area that hasn't quite set yet, you're going to remove some of the paint from the middle of that area, and it's going to be a paint ring around it, so it will leave like a coffee stain. So do like a stroke of your brush, remember, from the mid-tone area towards the highest highlight point. Remove the brush, because that will leave a little deposit of paint behind, so it will make that area a little bit brighter, and then leave it to dry. Now you can blow on it, that will make it dry quicker, or you can use a hairdryer. Lots of people do that. And it'll only take a couple of minutes, so you can see there's still a little bit of texture there and things, but it just gives a smoother transition. Then here I'm just putting a few highlights on the leather. Again, this is purely optional. Like, I haven't painted them very neatly here at all, and like, if you do want to do this, you probably want to do a slightly better job than I'm doing here. But I am using XV88 as the highlight colour. So remember, they were painted Mournfang brown to start with, then it had the oil wash, and then just XV88 as a quick highlight, just to pick out some of the details. You can put some scratches in. Remember to do both, like all the leather pouches all the way around. I'm just showing you quickly on this front one. But if you find that it goes a little bit too, like, you mess up a bit, or you don't like the look of it, just use a bit of Mournfang, water it down, and what you'll actually find is you can blend in the XV88 to the Mournfang brown, because remember, it's had the oil wash on it, so the Mournfang brown, when you apply it, is a little bit lighter, so you actually get like a bridge transition between the shaded Mournfang and the XV88, so you can just tidy things up a little bit that way. And if you want, you can do a final highlight using a bit of the Morghast bone as well, like I've got here. Be super careful doing this, it might make them too bright or they stand out too much. They're only like little secondary details on the model, so not that important. And again, like, you can just ignore these if you want. They're already shaded, and from the oil wash, so it's not that worth spending time on them. Here I'm just going to put some a bit of work on the metallics. Obviously they had the oil wash on, and there's been a layer of varnish placed on top of them as well, so that's killed the shine a lot. Now, I don't necessarily dislike the look of the metallics with the matte varnish on. It makes them look very kind of dirty and weathered as well. So if you don't want to do this stage, again, that's fine. I think it looks pretty good without doing anything to it. However, if you would prefer to have a bit of a higher contrast, because if you go over this with the metallics again, the light will catch it. You can see how it's shining on the skull there. Makes that shine quite bright, so it looks like it's almost white on the shine point. So that is then high contrast against the armor, which is a lot darker, and also it gives it a very different sort of material feel as well. So it looks like a more metallic surface. Just helps to separate it out from the armor. Then here I'm using some exhaust Manifold, or you can do whatever you want really. It's just it's a slightly lighter metallic color than the Gunmetal Gray. You could, if you wanted, add a bit of silver to the Gunmetal Gray, get the same effect, or I think Vallejo do a really nice chrome color as well. Be careful if you go straight to chrome, because that is a lot brighter than this. You only want to pick a few areas out, just the brightest points. It's basically the equivalent of adding white to black for the highlights, but instead you're using silver as the highlight instead. And don't go too crazy with it. Like, you don't want to, definitely don't paint it in any of the recesses. That's already been done with the oil wash. That keeps it all separated out, looking nice and grimy. This is just to give it, again, a bit of a high contrast pop to the metallics. So the final thing we're going to be doing is painting in the lenses very quickly. I'm just going to show you how to paint one lens, because the one on the right hand side is a little bit more tricky to reach. It's tricky enough anyway showing these lenses, because from the top down angle where I have the camera, there's obviously a lip on the front of the helmet where the eyes go into the in the socket. So but I'll do my best. I'm doing them as a very quick and dirty OSL effect. Like, if you want to spend a bit more time on it, on my Patreon or on my personal website, I have painted the Emperor's Champion model. He has some really nice OSL eyes on him. It's a similar sort of process to this, but I spend a bit longer just making it look cleaner and neater and a bit more menacing as well. So if you want to check that out for a more detailed approach on how to do this. But in terms of getting some stuff done quickly for army painting, I think this looks fine, and also like it still stands out nicely on the tabletop. Like, it's a nice bright red. So you can see what's going on. So to start with, I just used Mephiston red, and I completely flooded the area, like all the way into the recess, catching all the edges all the way around. Don't worry about getting any at the very edges of the eye. If you that doesn't need to have a black line around it, anything like that. Just completely flood the area, and then leave it to dry. Now I pushed through this a little bit quick again, so it could be a bit neater. You might find it needs just 2 or 3 coats just to get a very opaque finish. The more opaque, the better. You don't really want any of the black showing through, because that will then defeat the it just doesn't look as good in terms of making it look like it's glowing. So after the Mephiston red, then we have Evil Sun Scarlet. All we're doing with this is just painting the lens itself. So this, you do not want to get into the recesses. The recesses stay Mephiston red. This is just the raised areas. If you want, you could put a little bit on the edge just under his eye, but I'm not too worried about that. Be a bit careful, because if you go over the edge, if you get this into the recesses, if you paint too much, so you can see on the face mask just below the eye, there's quite a big ridge. You could cover all that in Evil Sun Scarlet, but Evil Sun Scarlet is not like a pure red. It's a little bit orangey, and the more of this you add, the less red the eye is going to look. Now, if you want an orange eye, that's fine, but those kind of areas, they they give the red the colour to it, because the eye itself is actually being taken up to sort of like a bright orangey colour. And it's the glow around it that makes it look red. But if you just paint all of it orange or red, orange or yellow or whatever, then there's not enough red there to make it look red. I mean, that's kind of obvious, but if you want that sort of evil looking, very sinister red look with red glow with an orange dot in the middle, if you like, this is how to do it. You have to leave the red to be seen. So after the Evil Sun Scarlet, then I've just mixed in some Fire Dragon Bright and a small amount of Yriel Yellow. That's the top right hand colour. Then you can see there I've just got pure Fire Dragon Bright, and then above that is pure Yriel Yellow. Now you could probably cut out one or two of these stages. The more steps that you have for the transitions, the smoother it'll look, but it is a very small area, so depending on, again, how much time you want to bother spending on it, maybe for the tactical troops, or whatever they're called, for the Black Templars, you might only want to do, say, like 3 stages. So paint it Mephiston red, do, say, like Evil Sun Scarlet, then a yellow dot in it or something like that. Again, that will show up fine on the tabletop, but for this guy I was just spending a little bit more time just to make it kind of interesting. And there we go, that's the end of the model. Now, of course, you could, if you wanted, spend more time on it, do better transitions, make it neater, or you can do it the proper way and use a gloss varnish instead of the matte like I used, and then it wouldn't quite be so brown. There. By the way, also you see the little on the forearm that holds the sword. It has these little red things, whatever they are, buttons, something or other. I use exactly the same colours that I just used for the eyes as well. But that's pretty much it. That's the end of the video. Please subscribe. I've got many more videos to come. I've got so many models to paint. My house is overflowing with them. And if you want to check out some of the my more higher end tutorials, then I have Patreon and my website, where there's a lot more Golden Demon type stuff that I spend a bit longer on. But anyway, so that's the end of the video. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.